Good morning. Hi, my name is Tudor Girba, and today I want to talk about telling stories. I usually concern myself with building tools and techniques that help developers not to read code. But by the way, talking about developers, how many of you here would consider yourself to be a developer? How many non-developer or less developer, let's say? Okay, some. So, by the way, you read correctly. It's a not read code. I'd be very happy to talk to you about that today. You can contact me afterwards. But today I really want to talk about value and the way we reach value. That's who wants to reach value? Right? Like, we all want to do it, but what is value? What's value? Would be your turn now. What's value for you if you want to reach it? What is it? By the way, if you don't know, there was a really interesting quote by Yogi Berra. He was a famous baseball player who had funny quotes, and one of them is that if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. So, what is value? What is value?
A product that solves a problem.
A product that solves a problem. That's an interesting thing. Anybody else? A happy customer, right? That's a program that solves a problem is something more palpable. A happy customer is somehow little bit more elusive, isn't it? Anybody else? A working program that solves a problem. That would be also useful, yeah. Anybody else?
Something about the right thing.
Something about the right thing. We just don't know exactly what that is. Yes? Anybody else?
Doesn't it boil down to money?
Doesn't it boil down to money? What about money? That it should cost a lot of money?
Yeah. What it brings.
What it brings should somehow be related to money, right? Well, the way I define value is something someone is willing to pay something for. Now, whatever that something is. And this is where the crux is, because it's not so clear what value is. I mean, on the one hand, we have concrete things, such as amount of users, right? You can have performance things. You can have lots of features. And those are directly measurable. And that's an interesting thing. And we focus a lot of our time on that. The interesting thing about that first category is that it's easily capturable in an Excel file, right? And because of that, Excel-minded people, there are people that are Excel-minded. That means the world somehow has to obey a linear model, because that's what Excel allows you to do. Like in an Excel simulation, those kinds of things, they are very high up on our preferences. But then if you think closely, there are other kinds of values that are less tangible and a little bit more difficult to measure. For example, usability, right? Somebody says here, a happy customer. That's much more difficult to measure. It's not impossible to measure. It's just that pretty much all measurements will be an approximation. And then there are even more elusive things that don't even have anything to do with the actual thing that you're interacting with. For example, you might find yourself buying something just because it was manufactured in an environmental friendly way. Isn't it fascinating? And that's value too. Value is incredibly multifaceted. And we shouldn't just look at it from one very narrow perspective. Now, what about, how do you design value? So, what is the design part of it? How do you define design? I define design as being the idea of you have to choose within a given set of constraints. By the way, if there's no constraint, there is no design, because there's no need for design. Design always happens within some set of constraints. And your job as a designer of a solution that works within those constraints is to basically choose the trade-offs. And ideally, focus on the beautiful trade-off. And we'll talk about that today. Now, how do we get to this. Now, if you think about it, right, we don't know exactly what value is. I mean, there can be so many things, so many ways in which value can appear to us or can manifest itself. And on the other hand, you have these unbounded possibilities of choice that is all being driven by the context in which you're particularly in. Right? This is such a tremendous challenge. It's not an easy thing, and it's definitely not straightforward. It's not something you say, oh, 1 + 1 = 2. It doesn't work like that. So how do we get to build value? And how many of you have heard of impact mapping? Now, impact mapping was built by, or developed by, it's a concept developed by Agile. It's pretty cool. The idea here is, it starts from the premise, from the observation that a lot of our time, our roadmap is actually not a roadmap, it's a tunnel. So it looks like this, right? You know where it starts, to the left, and you know where it ends, to the right. And it's just a succession of things that you want to do, and then you will enter in one way of your backlog, or the roadmap. And then you will end on the other hand, on the other part of that roadmap. And at the end, that's your road. But that's obviously not a roadmap. A roadmap is something that offers you alternatives. And that's where the interesting thing of impact mapping comes from. Because basically it says, at any given point, you should find yourself and explicitly choose the route you want to take, specifically when you encounter some sort of a problem. So the key elements here, are these joint points, those decision points. Those are the moment when you need to choose the trade-offs and steer towards value. Now you might notice that you might or might not end up in the place where you originally thought value will be. That's also an interesting thing. And so the idea there is work with your whole organization to build this map of possibilities. And at any given point in time, be able to steer to the left or to the right, depending on what you found out along the way. I like that. I think that's a really interesting proposition. And I think there's a lot of value in it. But there's a little tiny thing. There's a little tiny thing in that proposition, and that tiny thing has to do with how do you design? Is this enough? When you're designing something, what's the key element of knowing that the design works? Because basically what we're talking about here, we're talking about the process through which we have to go through to reach value. But it's not enough just to say, this is how we're going to do it. You also somehow have to be able to test that thing, to test that you are actually in the presence of value. Now, it sounds a little bit abstract, so let's make it a little bit more concrete. So, the problem here is, in an organization, it's maybe a bit larger of an organization, you have multiple layers, well, or at least multiple facets, different people. And at some point, there are the developers. And developers are those that actually manufacture that value. Now, does it not make sense to let the developers be the ones that show you the value? That's the proposition that I come with here today. I'm arguing that if you're a developer, you should be the one that should tell us what value is. Now, let's think of the product as having multiple of these layers, and then from a conceptual point of view, it looks like this. Okay, that's what it should be. Now, the user interface looks like this. It's a reasonable approximation. It kind of lets you do what the conceptual part should want you to do. But the implementation looks like this. Now, as long as if you're only focusing on external measurements of value, that means you're just focusing from the left side, right? Am I reaching my amounts of users? Am I reaching my amount of money that I want to get? Am I reaching the performance that I want to get through? But disregarding the right side of the picture. It's a little bit problematic because how do you know? How do you know 2 years down the road? How do you know that value is still there if you can't see it? It's a bit problematic. And it's, these two worlds, anybody here read The Time Machine? Or saw a movie, Time Machine? This H.G. Wells novel? No? There was this, and this, at some point, there's this guy invents a time machine and goes back in the past. That's not interesting. But he does it, and afterwards goes in the future. That's really interesting. And in the future, apparently there's not just one human race, but there are two. And they're called the Eloys and the Morlocks. And the Eloys, they are just working, they're living above the ground, and everything is beautiful, and they have everything they ever wanted. And they are rather, they are not violent, they're not, but they also don't have much abilities either. But then there are the Morlocks, because the idea here is in the Morlocks they work underground, and they actually provide everything that the Eloys need in order to have this beautiful life. And the Morlocks, they have a completely different life. They're very well built, and they are likely savages a little bit, and there's a very huge discrepancy between these two worlds. And this is what looks to me right now, right? Developers, they are meant to say, we don't really care where developers work, as long as the Eloys get what they want. And if you think about it, right, we have the term, right? So whenever it comes to the user, we talk about usability. And that's a beautiful thing. It brought us a huge step forward. It's a fantastic thing. But when we talk about, how do we talk about the things to the right? Oh, I know. We talk about technical debt. Right? Do you know that one? Who's familiar with technical debt? Everybody's familiar with technical debt. But you know what's the problem with technical debt? Technical debt is a negative metaphor. The best thing that can happen to you is that you don't have technical debt. That's a rather, that's not the world I would rather find myself in. But then there is a really interesting concept, and that's the concept of habitability. It was coined about 20 years ago by Richard Gabriel, and it's a beautiful concept. The idea here is that given that developers spend most of their time inside a software system, it's only natural that we should make that system suitable for human inhabitants. Right? Habitability. It's a beautiful term. We should pay attention to the conditions in which developers spend their time. And developers have first-hand interest such that those conditions are good. We had this kind of thing a long time ago when workers, we still have them, where workers were not really being paid attention too much. But that has changed. And similar things, the first thing we need to do is we need to make this concern explicit. But how do we tie this all to value? Because the problem, for example, technical debt, is that software is too often perceived as a cost. I think there's a huge missed opportunity that comes with that point of view. I think there's much more that we should do. So let's see, how do we find that out? So how do you bring this notion, of habitability in this whole product or value story? And so the main thing here is that you need to know is that if you're not happy, you're unlikely to produce value. So you owe it to yourself to be happy if you're a developer. And it's in the interest of business to keep developers happy, because that's what leads to value. Now the problem here is, whenever you see something like this, something goes only one way. What we learned from Agile is that whenever you're just going one way but without the feedback loop, there's a problem there. And the way you fix it is you introduce a feedback loop. Because that's how you test things. And so I'm saying that developers should be the ones that should show the value. That's the proposition. Let's see, how do we do it? Well, we know that feedback is key. Now, how do you get feedback? Now, what I'm saying is that, well, if this idea of value has to be embodied all the way down into the plumbing of your system, right? And it has to be easily exhibitable by the people that actually put it in there, well, they should be able to tell you what that value is, right? And then they should give the feedback in case they are maybe not on the same page, right? Maybe they did not understand something. Or maybe there are hidden opportunities that you didn't know when you created the vision first. And so feedback is really incredibly key there. But how do you get feedback? Well, the way you get feedback is you have to... why do we need to get feedback? Why do we need to get feedback at all, actually?
To adjust behavior?
To?
Adjust your behavior.
To adjust your behavior. But why would you need to adjust your behavior? To improve. But why would you need to improve? Are you not smart enough to do it the first time?
To get more value.
You get more value, but yeah, but why couldn't you figure it out in the beginning? Because you don't know. Well, actually, it's not quite true, because you knew enough to do something, right? It's just you didn't know the right thing. The assumptions are your enemy. And so what you want, the first thing you want to do if you want to get feedback is you want to expose your assumptions. Now, how do you expose assumptions? Well, you present them. That's the first thing you do. You want to make those things explicit, right? And you present them. And so, let's spend a little bit of time and talk about how do we present the assumptions. And if you think about how many of you are doing Agile, some sort of Agile something, Scrum, or whatever other kind of thing, TM things. Excellent, everybody is doing. So how many of you are doing this thing called review? Right? You're doing this review. That's a really interesting thing, right? You're doing this in Agile, and once in a while, basically when the iteration ends, you're doing the review. Now, that review is a magic place, because that's where feedback is supposed to happen. And so, how is a typical review happening? How many of you have sat through a review just to see somebody says, okay, so the story says that if I click here, I should get that. So I'm opening my tool, and I'm clicking here, and I'm getting this. Okay, next. This next story says that if I type here something, and I should do this, and I should get that. So I'm opening my tool, and I'm typing here something, and I'm doing something there, and I'm getting this. Next. And so it goes. And at the end, nothing really happens. Have you lived through something like that? Like less exciting, that really, not a really interesting thing that is happening, but the book says that we should do it, so we do it, right? That's a huge waste of opportunity. Now let's see, why is that? Well, think about that. Suppose you have a team, of 8. Maybe if you put together all the people that are really interested, like some consultants, some stakeholders, some whatever, some managers, you get to maybe like 20 people, right? And suppose that your review takes like 2 hours. That's a man-week of investment right there. That's the cost. Isn't it a pity that we just throw it away? It is. I think we should change that. And so let's see how. First of all, we have to look at the review and see it as an investment. That's the first thing. Second of all, let's find out, as I said, feedback is key, but before we find out how do we fix that thing, let's see what do we not want to have. So thing number 1 is, if there is no feedback, the whole thing was useless. If there was no question at the end, the whole thing was useless. If there is, and just the question part is not enough. If there is no idea of how to get to a better future, it was useless. And so, how do we change this? Oh, let's talk back to presenting. When I say present, I don't mean bullet pointing. I don't even mean slide showing. When I say present, I mean storytelling. That's the most effective way we know as a culture, as a species, to get somebody else's interest. And interest you want if you really want detailed feedback. Now think about it. The people that come to your review did not live within the context of that project for the last 2-3 weeks. They were doing something else. They just come out from a different meeting right there, having a completely different thing, talking about some Excel file. Sometimes Excel files are good, so it's not all bad. But the point is that they have a simply different focus. And then if you completely start with them and said, here's the fact, and another fact, and another fact, and another fact, it's just boring. And they will tune off. If you want to capture somebody's attention, you're starting to tell a story. Now, the interesting thing in software engineering is that we just have to tell the story. We have to show the story. That's why, during the review, you do a demo. Now, how should a demo look like? Now, before we talk about the demo, let's look at that thing called the user story. Who's familiar with this template? Like, who is not familiar with this template? Anybody not familiar with this template? This is like, really? Wow, very good. Keep it that way. No, but seriously, the idea is there's a good intention behind the template. As I want to, so that. In other words, make sure that you mention who wants something. Make sure that you mention what they want. And make sure that you kind of remind yourself as to why do they want that. You know, that's the idea of the template. What it boils down to is that you get these kind of stories that look like this. As a user, I want to be able to search in any folder so that I can find the things I'm looking for. Okay, it's not very interesting, is it? And if you think about it, there's a lot of, isn't it a technical, way of looking at this thing? It's just a very technical description. And this technical description does not lend itself to an interesting story. It's very hard to concoct a story around this thing. It's just, yeah, there's a lot of facts in there, but that's it. Now let's look at the same thing, but from a slightly different angle. So, I navigate to a folder where I think I have some folders and files of interest. I just don't know exactly what those are. Would it not be cool to search right in place, right there, to find what I'm looking for? It's pretty much the same thing, only structured in a slightly different way. And this structure looks more like this. First of all, I give you the context, then I give you a conflict, and then I give you a resolution. That's one way of looking at the story. It's not the only way, by the way. And the template doesn't really matter. What matters is the outcome. But do you notice, who likes this one more than the previous one? Like, who feels that this one tells a little bit of a more of a story? There is a scenario involved there. There is an expectation that I have. And I didn't even spend much time on that. But it works with different variables. We're not talking about the technical parts. We're talking about the interesting parts. Where is that conflict? When is it that value is being created? It's when I'm in that moment, I'm describing the moment when I need that value. And this then leads to a different way of building software systems. Now, let me just go quickly and show you a little demo. Now that we're on the subject of search, and that most of you are developers, I'll be showing you a little tool. Anybody familiar with the tool? It's called Eclipse. Great. So who is not familiar with this at all? Okay, great. So what I want now is let's just explore how search is embodied in this environment. Okay? I mean, it's a well-known, highly used tool. We should expect that people put some attention into it, and they did. So let's see. Well, first thing I want to do is, when you're looking for code, is what? What's the first thing that you want to search for? Anything? A class name. So that one is really supported nicely. So you press Apple Shift T, you get this dialog, and then you say, well, okay, let's find something. For example, Petit parser. And it's there, right? I get the completion. I just don't exactly get the source code, but I can quickly get to the source code. Now I'm in here, and I'm looking for the method called trim. How do I do that? Well, I'm in a different context, I want to now go and search. Now, the way I do it is, I think, if I press Apple O, and boom, a different dialog comes in. This one also has completion. And it's in place, and I go, and it gets me there. Rather interesting. All of a sudden, similar functionality has a slightly different ways of being implemented. Now let's go a step further. Another thing, for example, in Java is, or well, also in other languages, is that, well, sometimes there's a lot of usage of annotations. Would you agree with that? There's, there's a lot of reliance on annotations in modern systems. Now, would it not mean that we should find annotations very quickly? It should, right? Now, in Eclipse, this doesn't work so well. So the way you would do it is you would find perhaps things like you're doing a Java search, and then here I'm looking for deprecated, and I'm looking for the references to deprecated, for example, and then I'm searching. No? Deprecated. And so, yeah. Well, in any case, the point there is that, okay, all of a sudden, it seems that it takes too long. It's just complicated. There's no direct support to search for an annotation. And similarly, if I want to find now a method, right? Let's say that I'm looking for the trim method, or let's say I'm looking for the parse method. I have a parsing framework in here. Then I have to pick here a declaration. So I have a completely different way of doing things. And then I'm searching for it. And now I get the list here. And this is where all these parsing things happen. But I'm only interested in my project called Petit Parser. And so now I have to scroll down. What I would really love, I would love to be able to search right here in place, because that's something that, I would like to do. Instead, I can't get that. So that's how I found my method. Now, I haven't really talked about too complicated things. These are very easy things. And if you want to search through all the files and find something in a file, it's again even more complicated. Yet another solution that you have in there. So if you go back and look at how the search is being done in this environment, then you get different solutions for different kinds of search. Now, if you want to tell a story about this, it's going to be very complicated. And somehow it doesn't make for an interesting thing. All right, okay, there is some interestingness into it. It's interesting that you get some sort of a completion. It's interesting that you can search for multiple things. But it's just somehow, I think we can do better. Do you think that we can do better than this? Yes? I mean, search, think about that. And we're not talking about a feature that is, something secondary. We're talking about the central thing in development. And this is a tool to support development. So how come, why is it that at the end we have these technically working solutions, but somehow value isn't there? Or even if there is some value, it's not beautiful. So let's find a different way of doing things. So what I will show you now is an environment built in Faro. Faro. Anybody heard of Faro? Faro is a live programming environment. It's a Smalltalk inspired system, and it's a fully integrated. So you have the runtime and the development environment all in one place. So what I will do is I will do exactly what I've just done before. So now, because search is a central thing, then I have a central way of doing of a unified way of looking at it. So if I want to search for my parser class, let's say, which happens to be exactly the same one as the one implemented in the Java project, then I just find it here, right? And I can go and I can find my parser class. But the other thing I said, if I have my parser class, actually maybe I'm not interested in the parser class, but I'm interested in inside. I want to find that trim method inside my parser class. Now what I can do is I can have here a way to dive in. And now I'm in the context of my parser class. And now I can continue typing. I'm searching for my method. And the preview over here gives me right in place feedback. It's a different way of looking at the same thing. And then so if I want to go and browse it, I can just do and browse it. But the other thing I said, well, how about searching for annotations? So one annotation that I have in the image is the annotation that is being used to define these kinds of way of searching. So now I found the annotation. It's here. So let's find some more annotations. So these are the annotations that start, for example, with spotter. I will just pick one of them, and I'm diving right in. And now I have all the places where this annotation is being used. It's a very simple thing. It's a simple interface. Now, how else can we do? The other thing we said, well, how about searching for something in files? Well, I have here something. I have a folder that I know I want to look at. It's called folder for tests, and as you see, it appears right in place. And now I'm diving in, and as I'm diving in, that's a different context. And now I'm looking there at directories. I'm also looking at the script, and you see I can get directly syntax highlighting in there. I have a picture over here with various kinds of visualizations. As I said, that's what I do typically. There's a zip file in here, right there, right? And if it's a zip file, well, you see there are the contents here on the right-hand side, and I can just go inside and so on. And that's a zip file inside the zip file, and so on. And all of those places are easily searchable. And so the same thing can happen by navigating inside folders. I can go in a folder and in another one, and so on. And so the same thing done in the previous interface, now done completely different. So if you compare now this solution with that solution, which one do you find more interesting? Who finds the first one more interesting? Thank you. And now, if you look at the second one, did you notice how I could speak and talk at the same time? This is a very interesting characteristic of a demo, because if you can't speak and talk at the same time, it means that the story that you want to tell is not congruent with the story that you want to show. It's not quite the same thing. We can't do easily two things at the same time. In fact, we can't really do it at all, but let's pretend we can do some of it. But nevertheless, don't text while you're driving. But the second one is just much easier to demo, because first of all, it has less variables. Second of all, there is a story inside it. Now, that's not a coincidence. That isn't a coincidence, because the second one was built so that it can be demoable. And in fact, we threw 3 or 4 implementations away because we couldn't demo it. Or because the demo was too awkward or not smooth enough. When was the last time you threw an implementation away? Why not? If you know you don't get it right from the very beginning because of all those wrong assumptions, would it not follow that we should throw more than we keep? It should, right? I think it should. So that's the power of a demo. A demo, once you're exhibiting, once you as a developer can show that value with your tool, not talk about it, show the value with your tool. We have a much better probability that we are actually in the presence of value. And you have to also show it in a way that the stakeholders understand, which basically means you have to raise it out, above the technical details. That's the key aspect of this demo, right? The audience is the one that should give you feedback. And that's, this is hard. And if you don't pay attention, explicit attention to it, it just won't happen. So at the end, what the end result of it is that if it doesn't happen, then you're simply building technically working solutions that are very unlikely to carry real value. So now let's talk about that. Now, do we agree now that demoing is an important thing? Thank you. Is anybody not agreeing? Do we still have a challenger? No. Good. But if demo is an important thing, let's talk about how do we prepare a demo. Now, think about that. How many of you are preparing the demo the day of the review? Or one day before? Right? Everybody. Isn't it too late? Remember, you need to make the system tell your story. It's like, who remembers the time when the UI was developed at the end of the project? Right? That was the way not to get user experience done. That was the recipe for it. Now we know better. We put it much more in front. It has to be intertwined with the rest of the thing. Now, the problem is that, first of all, we're talking about the story behind the user story. Right? It's not the user story, not the technical one, but the really interesting, exciting story. Now, how do you get to do it? Now, the problem is that demoing is just the form. It's the way in which you exhibit. It's not the real thing. It's the form. And typically, we approach form very, very late in the process, typically at the end. By the way, this is what gets marketing a bad name. Because marketing, in traditional processes, it comes at the very end of the production line. And so at the end, you have the product, and then you give it to the marketers and let's go sell it. So marketing, the only option marketing has is to put a package on top of it and then hope that you won't notice the difference. Right? And you get disappointed because the package tells you something, and then you go and use it, and then it doesn't work as it's supposed to. The happiness doesn't happen. And so the problem there is that we see this form coming too late. And we have to bring it back, and we have to approach form and content together. So if demo is an important thing, you want to build it from the very beginning. You want to start with the demo in mind. Because that's an important thing. Now, you might not yet believe me, so let me tell you a story. In a previous life, in almost a different millennium, I used to do a PhD and my area was software evolution. The idea there was, well, you have this repository of data, right? This repository of source code, for example, and in that repository, there's a lot of information. So the question is, how can you leverage that information and say something interesting about the system? And one of the ideas there, for example, there was an idea coined at that time, was saying, well, if you, for example, one challenge there is if you're approaching a new system, you don't know anything about that system, the question is, where do you start reading? You don't just want to start alphabetically because that won't make sense, but the question is, where do you start reading? And one of those heuristics would be, well, you start reading from the places that were changed recently. Why? Because those places that were changed recently are also likely to be changed in the near future. Okay? Who's following me? Okay. Okay. But let's see. So I come from Romania, and then I noticed, well, in Romania, I was not particularly, let's say, active. I still am not, but I was a little bit lazy in how I would approach, for example, dressing up for the day. And so my rule of thumb was that I should dress up about the same way as I did yesterday. And that was fine for about 70–80% of the cases. Okay, ideally not quite the same way, but about. And that was fine. And then I moved to Switzerland. And there I noticed, well, you know, in Switzerland, this doesn't work. Because there, it can rain now, and then in 2 hours from there, it's sun again. So all of a sudden, if I would employ the same heuristic, it wouldn't work. Because the prediction rate of that heuristic in Switzerland on a daily basis would be about 30%. Now, if you think about that, you take the same heuristic and you go to it and you apply it, you know, you use it in Sahara. There you get a much more accurate prediction. It's about 90%, right? So basically what this means, it showed me was, well, the prediction, this heuristic is context-based. So you need to figure it out first, in which system are you? Are you more likely in Switzerland? Are you more likely in Sahara? And then use it or not, that heuristic, or maybe choose a different heuristic if it's in Switzerland. For example, in Switzerland, the other heuristic that works, always have a raincoat with you. It's a different heuristic, but it works. So, now, remember we were talking about how to predict code changes, right? How to predict the places where you want to start reading. So, then I will say, okay, so how do I measure that percentage for my system? And so I did. And I was so excited. It was my very first paper. And I was so excited because I had a really interesting idea, I thought. And then I went and implemented it. Now, this is the real implementation. I dug it up from 2004. And it's built in Smalltalk. Anybody know Smalltalk? So Faro is a Smalltalk system, as I said. So it's a beautiful language. And code in it should be beautiful. Okay? Now, the problem here is this here is one method. It's slightly too long. And it's not that I didn't know it. I knew it. It was too long. That thing over there, that's a comment saying that this is not good. Okay? I knew that this method was wrong. But it worked. And I was very, very happy because I could go and tell people, look, there are different kinds of systems. There are Sahara systems and there are Switzerland systems. In Switzerland systems, you don't use that heuristic. In Sahara systems, you do use that heuristic. Now, if these would have been, regular users, those that just are interested in the results, they would have gone with it. But in research, you also have to show how you're doing it, because you need to describe how that works, so that other people can do it the same way, build on top of it, and so on. And I couldn't. People kind of got the idea, but I couldn't explain them what I was doing. And it's annoying. The experiments were done. And it was correct. Because I also did it manually, like it took me a long time to measure those things. But I proved that it's correct. It was correct. But yet, I could not convince anybody of the value. So I went back to the drawing board. And that's what I did. Well, I said, let's take the history of our system. So let's say, for example, here I have 5 classes, and I have 5 different versions. The columns are the versions, the rows are the classes. That basically means that at any given moment I can take any of these columns to be the present, which will make those to the left to be the past, and those to the right to be the future, according to that present, right? Now, what my yesterday's weather says is that if, like what I need to check, is that what are those things that have changed recently. So those changed in the past, in the recent past, and I will compare them with those things that will change in the near future. If I get a reasonable overlap, that means that my prediction is a hit for that day or for that version. You do these things for all the versions, all right? That's the pseudocode. Okay, I take all those that have changed from the beginning to the present, and I take all those that will be changed from the present to the future, to the end, and then I intersect the 2 sets. That's it. If the intersection is not empty, that means that at least one of those that I would have read would have been really interesting for the near future. Okay? Sounds reasonable? So you do this one, you average it for the whole history, and then you get your yesterday's weather for that system. So I then went back and implemented it, and then it looked like this. And the paper got accepted, and I was happy. Now, who got that presentation? Who understood what I just showed? Okay. Now, what you've just witnessed, it should have been a dry, scientific presentation full of formulas. Because it's a lot of math going on in there. That was my original approach. It didn't work. I had to go back and tell and find out what that story should be. And the interesting thing is that once I found the story, the model changed. The implementation changed. This one here is a much more beautiful implementation. And it's actually as long as the pseudocode. That's the relationship between form and content. In fact, one cannot really exist without another because we can't experience content in its pure form. We need the form. Now, if you're still not with me, let me tell you a different story. So, anybody know this guy? He's a famous neurologist. He's called Mahandran. And he has a way of approaching neurological problems, and he's studying them by finding odd cases that happen to the brain and then find ways to experiment with that in order to find out how the brain works. Now, one problem that he has very famously dealt with is the phantom limb. Anybody knows the phantom limb, what that is? So phantom limb is that, so suppose you have some sort of a pain, and for example a gangrene, and then they amputate the arm, for example, and then the patient still feels the pain in the non-existing arm, which is a terrible thing to have because there is no way to get that pain out because the arm is not there anymore, but the pain is. And it's an amazing thing. Any of you saw Dr. House? There was once an episode in Dr. House. Well, it's like that. It's just it doesn't work that fast. And the solution that he built costs $2 or so, and it works like this. It's a mirror. So the idea is that if you have the normal limb still available, then you can put it in front of the mirror, look in the mirror, and then say, now do exercises with your normal limb. And that relieves the pain, which is amazing. Now the idea here is that we can't even perceive our own body without the form. Form and content are one. You shouldn't just exclusively focus on the content because then you will probably miss the target. And then I'll tell you a final story, and this one bothered me for a while. Now I'm an Apple fanboy, and I go to the extreme and I watched all available public Apple appearances ever, I think, or at least all those that I could see. And especially the keynotes. And one thing that really struck me is that sometimes about the time when the Mac Air was thrown in the world, they started to, inside. Who's watching Apple keynotes? Okay, you don't have to, but no, seriously. I mean, I'm not advertising for Apple, but one thing is clear with Apple is that you just can't ignore what they do. I mean, you might like or not like, but you can't ignore what they do. And it bothered me that why would they started to spend an incredible amount of time talking about the inside of the computer or of the whatever hardware they were showing. And this is particularly odd. Why would you talk about the inside of a piece of machinery that I'm not even allowed to see? It doesn't make any sense. And it bothered me for a while. And up to the point in which they spent a lot of time on their websites, showing you the interior of the machineries that they sell. So this is one, right? Another one, screens or camera or whatever, the digital touch, the camera. But the interesting thing is that they even show you the cooler. The cooler. No, seriously? I mean, that's like the most unexciting thing in the whole thing. The cooler. And if you look into the Mac Pro, like this thing that I don't quite understand, but it's just shiny and stuff, they have a video showing you how the cooler actually works. Why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. Remember, this is something about, spending a lot of marketing space talking about something I will never get to see. And then, you know what's the interesting thing? Google does it the same. Why? And then I saw this TED Talk.
And by the way, I was little. My father told me a story about an 18th century watchmaker. And what this guy had done, he used to produce these fabulously beautiful watches. And one day one of his customers came into his workshop and asked him to clean the watch that he bought. And the guy took it apart, and one of the things he pulled out was one of the balance wheels. And as he did so, his customer noticed that on the back side of the balance wheel was engraving were words. And he said to the guy, "Why have you put stuff on the back that no one will ever see?" And the watchmaker turned around and said, "God can see it." Now, I'm not in the least bit religious, and neither was my father. But at that point, I noticed something happening here. I felt something in this plexus of blood vessels and nerves, and there must be some muscles in there as well, somewhere, I guess. But I felt something, and it was a physiological response. And from that point on, from what I later decided, I began to think of things in a different way. And as I took on my career as a designer, I began to ask myself a simple question: do we actually think beauty, or do we feel it?
That's it. God can see it. You don't have to believe in God to feel moved by that. I think there is a very powerful thing that goes on in there. And I don't know what's going on inside all those shops that are working behind closed doors. But I think that if you leave that story when you're building it, marketing becomes much cheaper. And marketing doesn't even have to sell. It can be true to the product. It doesn't have to sell something that doesn't exist. And there is more happiness that goes throughout the whole thing, the whole chain. Now, even Apple or Google, they talk about these hardware things. But do you notice how none of them talks about the software part? Why not? There's a lot of beauty in software. Form and content are one. And it's up to us to make that choice. It's up to us to choose how do we approach what we do for a living. And if we understand that this form and content go together, then we will start to build value. And how is that value looking like? Now, if you look at this product with all these different facets, and again, this is a simplification of the product, what you're hoping for, and what, for example, happened in my little case study with the paper, was that by re-understanding the story that I want to tell, remember, the facts didn't change. No results changed in that case, only the way it was carried through. And the stories, the implementation can change. But the other thing is also happening. If you're really catering for feedback, then you also have to be willing to say, remember, design is about finding beautiful trade-offs within the given constraints. And technology is a constraint, a huge one, by the way, especially in our world. So we owe it to the rest of the world to make the world also see those constraints and make those choices too, also from a conceptual point of view. So that triangle doesn't necessarily have to be a triangle at the end. It's we choose as a team. And all this works if you see form and content coming together. And my argument here is that if you want to build that value, if you want to go towards that value, start from the story. And start from making your system tell that story. Now, this is not easy. And it will not come in by default. It won't happen by default. Especially not in a technical world, which is dominated by facts. But storytelling is a skill. And like any skill, it can be trained. But and the first step in that direction is that you should acknowledge that this is a problem. And then look around at how to implement this. Thank you very much. So don't forget to vote at the end, and I'll be around during the conference if you want more questions.